back to Trailblazing Justice. Julia and Zach are back, along with Kyle Black and Mark Wilson. In this episode, we continue our special series on solitary confinement by turning our focus to Oregon's only women's prison, Coffee Creek, and the often overlooked realities of solitary confinement behind its walls. Kyle Black shares firsthand accounts of the degrading strip searches, traumatizing isolation, and the human toll of a system designed to punish, not protect. We explore how solitary is used as a catch-all for everything that the prison can't or won't address, and ask, who is truly being kept safe? And a content warning. This episode contains discussions of suicide, self-harm, and sexual abuse. Listener discretion is advised. If these topics are distressing for you, please take care while listening, and consider skipping this episode if needed. Help is available to anyone struggling with suicidal thoughts. Call 988 to speak to someone today. This is Trailblazing Justice, episode 63, recorded Thursday, May 8th, 2025. Solitary Confinement in Oregon, part 2 of 5. It's time for Trailblazing Justice, the weekly podcast where we discuss civil and criminal rights in Oregon and beyond. Trailblazing Justice is a production of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. Here's Bobbin.
Welcome back to another episode of Trailblazing Justice. I'm Bobbin Singh, the Executive Director of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. And in this week's episode, we have the full crew back with us. Julia Yoshimoto, the Director of our Women's Justice Project and Senior Advisor, Zach Winston, the Director of Policy and Outreach, Mark Wilson, Paralegal, Legal Assistant and Policy Associate, and Kyle Black, our Policy Associate. Today, we're going to be following up on our conversation of solitary. We're calling this Solitary Part 2, where we're going to be focusing in on isolation, solitary at Coffee Creek, the women's prison. But just to give us started, I think it'd be good to just kind of recap our previous conversation, which we had with Mark about solitary in the men's prison. Mark, do you just want to go over, we use the term solitary. We talked about this, but that's just a broad umbrella term for a condition that we know as essentially forms of isolation. And we talked about several different forms of solitary that the ODOC uses. Do you mind going over those again, just briefly describing what those are?
Sure. We talked last week or the week before about disciplinary segregation. That's when somebody commits a rule violation within the prison system or is accused of committing a rule violation and is placed in there under investigation of that rule violation and then goes through a hearing process and is given a disciplinary sanction. At the time that I was in there, that was up to 180 days in segregation. Now it is up to 90 days in segregation. Typically, it's 30 to 60 days is the average time people probably serve in there for most offenses that put them in segregation. There is also administrative segregation that is just segregation that has no sanction attached to it. Prison officials can put you in there for any reason they want to. They can say it's for your own safety. They can say that you create some kind of risk to the population. They could say that your crime and notoriety creates some kind of security threat to you or to the population. There's really no end to the things that they can come up with to put you in administrative segregation. There is no set period of time you can be in administrative segregation. People could be in administrative segregation for years. There is the intensive management unit, which the prison officials are calling a program unit. And you typically end up in the intensive management unit after serving a disciplinary sanction for a rule violation. So it's an additional sanction for a disciplinary rule violation. And the reason for that was prior to the 1990s, there was no limit on the amount of time you could serve in disciplinary segregation. So people could spend years and years in disciplinary segregation. But federal court decisions required the Department of Corrections to limit the amount of time that people could serve in disciplinary segregation. And so that's when the 180-day cap came into effect in disciplinary segregation. And the way that prison officials got around that was to create the intensive management unit and call it a program unit. And therefore, you move from your disciplinary segregation at the cap and move into the program unit that has you in there for an indefinite period of time that you have to program your way out of. So those are the three main ways there are segregation. There's also behavior health segregation unit, which for severely mentally ill people are segregated from the general population. There's also medical quarantine or medical isolation that is also another form of segregation. So I think those are pretty much the general ways that they identify segregation in the Oregon prison system. And they are all simply variations of or forms of solitary confinement.
Yeah. And again, just for reference, when you use the term solitary, what we're really referring to is that condition or those circumstances in which people are in their cell or restricted and are unable to access or get access outside their cell. And one of the other ones that we just recently talked about and we've done a report on is on lockdowns or modified operations, where people are restricted to their cells for extended periods of time. While not technically solitary, but it acts and functions very similarly, where people are limited in their cells for extended periods of time without access to hygiene or showers or sunlight or fresh air, those types of things. In the next podcast, the conversation that we'll have, we'll focus more on disciplinary segregation and the process, the administrative and legal processes that challenge those and what that looks like. So that'll be the next solitary conversation that we have, just so people and our supporters and listeners can get a sense of, once someone is placed officially in solitary, the challenges that exist in challenging your placement in there, that they're basically non-existent. And I don't know that people fully appreciate that. And there are a lot of bizarre aspects of that we'll discuss. But for today's episode, we'll move into Coffee Creek. And the reason why we wanted to separate this out is because Coffee Creek is the only women's prison in Oregon. And I'm wondering, Julia, if you could just give us a little bit general, bullet point facts about Coffee Creek and help us situate, where it's at and, who's there and things like that.
So Coffee Creek Correctional Facility is the only women's prison in Oregon, and it's located in Wilsonville. And it was built in 2001 or opened in 2001. And in addition to housing women, it also is the location for the intake center where all the men who are going to be serving time in DOC prisons go into the intake center there and get processed and assigned to their prisons, and then are transported out to the men's facilities. And I think that would be something to highlight for folks is just this. It creates a lot of problems for women at Coffee Creek to have the intake center there, but that's for a different day to talk about that. But on the women's side, there are two facilities that are, at least for the women, operated separately. I think they share staff, but there's a minimum security facility and a medium security facility. It holds, its built capacity is a little over 1,200. And I think the numbers are split pretty evenly. Kyle, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's half bed space at the minimum side and half bed space on the medium security side. The minimum security side has dormitory units. That's how the housing units are set. There's more outdoor space. There's classrooms. It feels there's more ability for people to get outside and move around than on the medium security unit, which most of the living units there are cells like you would think of as a prison, where and I think there might be one or two units that are dormitory style. A big difference between medium and minimum is that medium is very much enclosed. And so it can be that women are living on their day-to-day and they never really get outside into fresh air because they're just walking through these long corridors of the institution from their work sites to their housing units to getting their food. And so you can stay enclosed in this concrete metal building for much of your day.
Yeah, and there's been a lot in the news about Coffee Creek in the past couple of years. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But, it is interesting that Coffee Creek always gets held up as this more modern prison because it was built more recently, and that it's in Wilsonville. So it's, located more in the valley and people can get access to it. But since its opening, Coffee Creek has almost been in the news every year for either condition issues or sexual abuse issues. It just happens over and over again. And Mark, I know you've written extensively about this for Prison Legal News. Can you remember a period or a time in which Coffee Creek hasn't been in the news for that?
No, it's funny. Well, not funny. It's sad, really. As Julia said, Coffee Creek opened in 2001, and as far back as 2004, there were huge cases of sexual abuse by staff against prisoners there. And when I say huge, they're not one-off cases. These are one or multiple staff sexually abusing multiple prisoners. And every time the Department of Corrections would say in the media and to the legislature and to others that they have zero tolerance, but it continues to happen over and over and over again. And interestingly, as it relates to solitary confinement, on December 28th of 2023, the Capitol Chronicle reported about one of these sex abuse cases. And in this case, it was a guard that was working in the segregation unit that was sexually abusing prisoners in there, and other guards knew about it, were not reporting him, and were looking away to enable him to continue to engage in this misconduct. And there were allegations against this guard that prison officials and the Washington County District Attorney's Office ignored before later charges came out against him again. And then they finally decided to pursue actions against this guy. But by them ignoring it at the first time this surfaced, it gave him the ability to go sexually abuse additional prisoners. And, this is just an ongoing thing that is because I guess, prisoners are not human or don't matter, and it's okay to do whatever you want to do to them. And
you're saying that facetiously or sarcastically?
Well, I'm saying that must be that must be what they think. Yeah. It just makes no sense that this is allowed to go on.
The pervasive culture of Coffee Creek. And speaking more broadly about that, the only reason why I wanted to just touch upon that is to say that there's a long historical record of abuses and just these grotesque violations that have been happening at Coffee Creek. It's not something that, from almost from the outset, like this had this problem. And I think there was some crystallization about sort of the culture that you're talking about, or that you alluded to, Mark, sort of the pervasive culture at Coffee Creek with the Gipper report that came out now 2 years ago. We've done a podcast on the Gipper report, but Julie, do you want to just mention what the Gipper report was, and then maybe focus it what the Gipper report said specifically about solitary, so that way we can segue in back into that?
Yeah, I can. I'll describe the Gipper report, but I would just like to add one thing about Coffee Creek being highlighted as a newer facility, a nicer facility, a better facility for the women. And I think I would like to hear from Kyle, who had served time in the old women's prison and then made that transfer into Coffee Creek, because one thing that we're going to talk about segregation and these solitary confinement units at Coffee Creek. But one thing that Kyle has brought up to me and other women who have served in both the old women's prison and at Coffee Creek is how the physical structure of Coffee Creek was based off of designed after a men's facility. I believe it was TRCI, and how moving from the old women's prison to the new prison became more isolating because of the way the layout is. Women have less opportunity, especially, and I'm really speaking to the medium side, to interact with each other and see each other. And that form of isolation, I think, is not really talked about as much, but that has an impact on people's day-to-day life, separate from the solitary confinement.
Yeah, we'll invite Kyle to come in just after, if you can give us the overview of the GIPA.
The GIPA report was basically an audit on Coffee Creek that was commissioned by the state legislature, and out-of-state experts on gender, and it was to do an audit of Coffee Creek to look at its policies and practices from admission into the prison to release, and to see if they were aligned with gender responsive, evidence-based practices and trauma-informed practices. And so out-of-state experts came in and did an audit of Coffee Creek and published a report as to its findings. And I think the report came out in August of 2023.
Yeah, and we'll do a follow-up conversation on the GIPA and things that we've done since then. We talked a little bit about it in our legislative conversation as well about the GIPA omnibus bill. But what did the GIPA report say about, because it was an audit, talked about all aspects of Coffee Creek. Can you help us get into the solitary conversation by telling us what the GIPA report said about solitary?
So what the GIPA report said about solitary, and I think maybe it's a little long, but I think it's worth just sort of reading what the report says, because I think the language is pretty concise and makes it clear. What the GIPA report says, and they call solitary confinement the special housing unit. And at Coffee Creek, the special housing unit is on the medium security side. And it is actually, unlike I think some of the men's prisons, it's one unit that's split into two sides, and they hold almost all the different types of solitary that Mark was talking about in this one unit. And they call it the special housing unit, or the SHU. So it says the special housing unit is one of the least dignified and trauma-informed spaces at Coffee Creek. The SHU appeared unclean, unmaintained, stark, and overall lacking in a human-centered, dignified, gender-responsive, and trauma-informed design. It is painted in institutional colors, and various features of the environment are not only inattentive to trauma, but can be trauma-inducing, including the shackles chained to the walls, the floor-to-ceiling closet-sized cages, and restraint desks. Space for programming is seriously inadequate, and what is available has a carceral feel. This is particularly problematic given that the residents placed in the SHU are often experiencing deep levels of distress. In its current condition and as currently designed, it is virtually impossible for the SHU to function as a space where residents can achieve stabilization. In fact, despite staff efforts, the visual space, physical environment, and operational practices within the SHU are reportedly causing serious mental, emotional, and physical distress among residents and high levels of stress among staff. And this is by out-of-state experts who have worked in other correctional facilities and who have studied gender-responsive and trauma-informed care of people in prison.
Yeah, and I think everything that we heard in that is not inconsistent from what we heard with Mark in the last conversation about what solitary looks like and the impacts of solitary. But before we dig deeper into that, Kyle, would you mind just doing a brief reintroduction of yourself? I know you introduced yourself back when we talked about the legislative things. And then, we've talked a lot about Coffee Creek. We've heard about the issues related to sexual abuse. We've now talked about the solitary stuff. Generally with the GIPA report, Julia had mentioned the idea of the old prison and new prison. After you introduce yourself, I want to come back to some of the things that we've already mentioned and get your thoughts on like what you've heard and sort of your actions to those things.
Sure. Hi, my name is Kyle Colleen Black, and I am formally incarcerated of 26 to 27 years in Coffee Creek and the old women's prison. And I'm currently working at Oregon Justice Resource Center in the Policy and Outreach Department. And I love lifting up those that are incarcerated and talking about how it doesn't work and how it could work better. And so I am happy to talk about segregation in hopes of being able to really bring it to people's minds, because, Julia referenced that it was modeled after Twin Rivers or TRCI, and out of sight, out of mind. And out here in the community, the way that people think about people who are incarcerated, they really don't, because they are out of sight, out of mind. And then you get into a prison environment and you can get up to 100 people in segregation and you don't see them. You don't hear from them. You don't know what's happening to them. Nobody talks about them. And I was awarded the ability to go back there and see people and to be inspiring and trying to help them while they're back there and deal with it. And the number of things that I saw, it's heartbreaking. It really is. And I don't know whether you would just like me to start talking about that, or if you wanted to do some other framework.
Yeah, I want to ask a couple other questions before we jump into that specifically. But it's an interesting point that you made, because this is also something that Mark had mentioned in our previous conversation, that prison in itself is solitary or isolation. And then isolation or solitary in prison is just solitary within solitary. It's just isolation within isolation. So it's interesting to hear you sort of articulate that concept, but differently in the way that Mark mentioned it as well. And but some of the things that we heard, or Julia mentioned, were the GIPA report and the previous Oregon Women's Prison and this one. Can you just talk to us generally about life in Coffee Creek and the experiences, and starting from the old women's prison and the transition into the new prisons, very high level, but just so listeners can get some sense of what it was like in there for you and what you saw how it was like for other people.
The old women's facility, so the building was literally falling apart. If you were to run water in a cup, there would literally be rocks in it, and there was flooding, and the walls sweated. You couldn't put your clothes up against it or your bed, so everything was in the center of the room so that everything didn't come out wet. And at some points, we actually slept with all the doors open because the air system was so bad. And so that was the reason that the new prison was built. But the thing that my first year incarcerated, I really got interested in segregation because a friend of mine had tried to kill herself and had ended up in segregation. And at the old women's facility, you could look at segregation and people could wave out of their windows and they could see you. And so I started writing people who were in segregation then. But the only thing, the old segregation at OWCC, it was a really dysfunctional place. There was a woman who hung herself there. There was an escape from segregation. It was cold. It was dark. It was damp. It was everything 10 times worse than what was out in the general population. And nobody knew what was happening there. And then when we moved to Coffee Creek, it was even worse because the segregation unit is completely removed from anything anywhere. Nobody goes back there. Inmates aren't allowed back there. And so literally people do their time without seeing anybody or just seeing the other people in segregation. And, to think about what's happening in segregation. So they're taking everybody who's suicidal, everybody who is having an outburst. They used to take people for using, and they used to take people for self-harm. They used to anybody who was trying to kill themselves. So they had an incredible amount of people who were sad, brokenhearted, going through different things. And then you would have people screaming 24 hours a day. And I knew a woman, this was way back at OWCC, and she was a bookkeeper of sorts. And she was, a professional person, and she got into an argument with another person, and they took them both back to seg. She ended up having such a difficult time mentally that right before she left segregation, she started wiping her own feces on the wall, just being locked down for 24 hours in 2 week time period. And it literally changed her, and she was never the same. And
before you move forward, like, because you touched upon a lot of different things there that I want to kind of explore with you a little bit. One of the things, Mark had mentioned at the outset that solitary sort of manifests in these different ways, like disciplinary segregation, administrative segregation, IMU, medical isolation, and then lockdowns we've talked about. Is that true for Coffee Creek Crews, or are those like the different types of solitary that were there at Coffee Creek?
Yes, and really, segregation is used to catch everything you don't know how to deal with. Yeah. And the people, if there's an alleged sexual relation, or if there's an investigation for your phone calls, or if there's an investigation that you could be doing some sort of fraudulent financial activity, you're put in administration seg. And then there's your disciplinary seg for those that may be fighting or using or having sex. And then you have your mental health portion of it for people who are just unable to daily function in general population. And then you have your people who are self-harming and your people who are suicidal. And putting that all together with disciplinary officers who aren't trained to deal with all those various scenarios. And yes, it's a combination of all of the above.
So, Mark, does that kind of tracks with what you were saying, right? Like that's the kind of diversity of kind of population or behaviors or reasons people will be putting into segregation or isolation in the men's prison, right?
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. Kyle, so in Coffee Creek, you were mentioning solitary it's removed from the general population. Is it just one place? Is there just like one unit for segregation, or are there multiple places? Because you were mentioning multiple types of behaviors or actions, that could result in being put into segregation.
There is, yes. And so there is one segregation unit that is split in half, and part of it is behavioral and the other is disciplinary. And then there is the MHI, or mental health, and that's located in the infirmary. And like Mark was talking, one of the ways that when those 180 days came about in regards to limiting the amount of time that someone could spend in segregation, transferring them from segregation to disciplinary to administrative seg to MHI, the labeling is different. And so you could keep someone in segregation for quite some time if you shuffled them around to the different physical places or the different cells that are located within this segregation.
So, I mean, what's interesting about your story, and one of the things I learned about you as you were releasing or prior to your release was the fact that you were, I think, the only individual that was allowed to go back into the segregation unit to work with the women there. Is that true? Were you the only one, or were you one of the few, or how did that happen?
It happened because the woman who was sentenced to death row, the intake mentors started meeting with her. And so we started going back to visit with her. And it was just a couple of us.
Just to clarify, Oregon did have a death row. I mean, there were individuals on death row. Between legislation of Senate Bill 1013 and Governor Kate Brown, currently there's no one under a sentence of death. But there was one woman that was under a sentence of death. And what you're saying, that individual was kept, because there's not a death row in Coffee Creek, she was kept in isolation?
She was kept in isolation, and that in and of itself was a can of worms, because segregation is looked at as a disciplinary section of the institution, and she wasn't a disciplinary person or in trouble, but she was housed with everyone who was being held in segregation. And so she was treated as if she was a disciplinary problem. And, death row is a high profile case. And so she was back there and she was getting name call. People were calling her names. They were harassing her, and officers didn't do very much about it. And she was bullied by quite a few AICs and staff as well. And part of that really came about the fact that nobody sees what happens while you're back in segregation. And 3 of us started visiting her, and then I started talking to them about, can I see some of the other gals that are back here? Because I think it could be motivational, it could be helpful, it could be, a win-win scenario for them to be seeing people and talking to people. When you start spending years in solitary confinement and you have a mental health issue, being locked up 24 hours a day doesn't help that. A friend of mine who is back there, she heard voices, and she oftentimes would be banging her head against the wall to the point where she needed stitches. And one of the things that always irritates me is that while in segregation, the highest level of security within an institution, she got an additional 15 years on her sentence. And that to me is just asinine, because here's an individual that we know has difficulty maneuvering on a daily basis, and the way that she was treated. And I do believe that there were instances where she was antagonized and had no recourse, didn't have anybody to help her, didn't have anybody to talk to. And I think that it should actually be illegal for someone to get additional charges while they are locked up. And anyway, yes.
Yeah. I mean, all of this, I want to talk a little bit more about your experiences, but, one of the things that strikes me very immediately is when Julia was reading the GIPA report, there was a word that it used in there, stabilization. Can you read that? Can you find that phrase or statement? And it said something like, it's not effective for stabilization.
It says that it is virtually impossible for the SHU to function as a space where residents can achieve stabilization.
I find that such a curious word for solitary, that, somehow these isolation units are something to help stabilize individuals. And in some ways, it's a good umbrella term, because that's what DOC tries to use it for, whether it's for behavioral issues or, some of the other, if they've committed infractions and they're sanctioned, it's an idea you are stabilizing the offender or the individual, or if it's these other sort of behavioral issues that come up, you're removing them to stabilize it. It's just such a curious word to me, but it seems like everything we know about isolation is that it's actually very destabilizing, to the things that you're talking about, Kyle. So anyways, that just struck me. But can you walk?
It does bring to mind this one story that I have of a client of mine who they actually put her in SEG for this idea of stabilization. She had heard about a loss in the family, was very distraught, and made what now to her is a mistake, telling an officer that she was feeling suicidal. So what they did to her is they removed her. This was on a Friday, and they put her in segregation. And they put her in segregation over the weekend, where there are no mental health, supports. And during that time, she actually saw somebody trying to hang themselves in their cell. And they watched as this person was forcefully and violently extracted from their cell. This woman was completely traumatized by that whole experience over that weekend. And when Monday came and the mental health person was going to be there, she made sure, she said everything that she needed to in order to get out. And she was never again going to tell anyone in the facility how she was feeling, because that was their response to someone feeling suicidal, is putting them in segregation.
And I want to come back to this, because I want to ask a little bit down the road, Mark, this thing about suicide watch, because I've heard anecdotes in the men's prison about this as well. But Kyle, just getting back to solitary at Coffee Creek, can you kind of visually walk us through what it's like going back into isolation? Like when you went to go visit these people, what was it like for you? What did you have to do to actually get back there? And then can you describe how you interacted with the individuals once you were back there? Like where were they kept? What did the isolation units look like? And then what was your interactions? What was that like? I mean, I can't imagine you had the ability just to walk back there anytime you wanted and sit at a table and, play cards with people or help, engage with them in some positive pro-social way, right?
Well, I'd like to say it involved a lot of stripping and a lot of chains.
Yeah.
And so you're stripped when you go in, and then you go in a room. And in the beginning.
So when you're walking and you're in the prison, do you go through like a separate entranceway gate? Are you checked?
You do. You have to go through a set of doors to get to segregation, and then you are patted down, and then you are taken into a room and you're stripped while you're chained to a wall. And then you strip, and then you get dressed again. Then you're unchained to the wall, and then you're walked into a room where you sit by yourself, and then you're chained to the wall.
And this is you. This is you.
And this is me. And this is me as a volunteer coming in to talk to women.
Well, and hang on a second, Kyle. Explain what that means to be stripped. I mean, because you're going to help people. I mean, you're not just taking your clothes off. What else is going on there? I mean, why are you taking?
And only if you're comfortable sharing.
No, that's fine, because I'm all about ending stripping, because what you do is you get handcuffed to the wall. You're literally one-armed, chained to a wall, and then you're told to take your clothes off. And so you take all your clothes off. Half of them are hanging on your arm on the wall, and you're standing there butt naked, and you need to show all of your openings, and then you show them your openings. And then once you have passed the test that you're not carrying anything in, then you get dressed back, and then you are unchained to the wall. And all of that happens while someone is watching you, of course. And so
that's coming in and going out, correct?
And that's coming in and going out. And that happened for about a year. And I went back to segregation for 10 years. And I'm actually, as I'm talking to you, I'm literally holding my arm out here on the side. And then you're taken into a room where you sit by yourself and you're chained to a wall. And then the person that you're visiting comes into the room that is attached to that room, and there's a window in the middle. And then that person is chained to their wall. So and in segregation.
It's sort of like, I think, what people think about, on TV shows as similar to like visiting. When people are shown visiting, you have like a plexiglass window or glass like between you and the other person. But in this instance,
correct,
both chained to the wall, sitting.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And the irony of it is the person who is in segregation is literally maybe traveling 20 feet, 30 feet to that room, and they are shackled with their hands behind their back with a tether for the officer to hold on to, and their feet are shackled as well. And so they're not even shackled to the wall like you are. Not at that point. Then they're put into the room, and then they're shackled to the wall.
Okay.
Then they're shackled to the wall. So the lead in to the room, they're shackled completely. And that never changed for the 10 years. That was always the prerequisite.
And as you mentioned, they're only moving.
Yes, a very small amount. And then visits continued in that room. And after a while, they stopped stripping me to go in, which was fine. And then the handcuff for me ended. This is also that I didn't have to be handcuffed at the wall, but for the person in segregation, they were always handcuffed.
And so I think Mark alluded to this, like the going in and out. So you're stripped going into this room where you're chained. You don't have actual physical interactions with the individual. I assume there's nothing in the room. And then they search you on the way back out of a room that you're chained to. in which you have
Correct.
access.
With no interaction between that person. And there's only a window between us. And then the rest of it is the cinder block, which we can all picture how thick a cinder block is.
Well, and let me pause you for a second here. I mean, part of this is, she's going back into the SEG unit to provide a benefit to help people in the unit. The guards don't want that. And they don't have to strip people going in and out of SEG. There's times in the men's prison where there's electrical things that need to be done or whatever. And sometimes they'll strip people going in, and sometimes they'll say, yeah, we don't need you. Just come on in and do this and be done with it. They're stripping her because they don't want her in there, and they're trying to dissuade her from going in and helping these people.
Because clearly it's discretionary, because at some point they stop doing it with you, right?
Correct. Yeah. Correct. Yes. And then I started meeting more people in segregation and meeting more women, and I would meet them in a classroom, which contains chairs that are like student chairs, but they're set up so that someone can sit in them while their feet are handcuffed and that their arms are handcuffed. And I would have to have my feet handcuffed and my arms handcuffed as well. And so you're always shackled. You're never not shackled. And so that was how I would visit with some of the other women, and we would work on some art projects and stuff. But I would like to comment on your emphasis on the word stabilization, because I would just, you were asking about.
Not my word. That's what the GIPA used. And I thought it was very curious. Yeah.
Well, and on that word stabilization, to just picture a day in segregation and what it was like. And there were a lot of times when I was in segregation, and due to staffing levels or due to emergencies or whatnot, I would spend extensive hours down there because they couldn't come and get me out, because I couldn't just leave because I was shackled to everything or in a locked room. And so I would spend quite a few hours down there and see the things that were happening to people. And when you think of being completely isolated, where you're isolated in your own cell with a group of people who are either ranting, raving, screaming, or just, having a day. And then you need things like female products. You need things like toilet paper. You need your medication. When is your food going to come? When is your clothing going to come? And the stress and the anxiety that it causes to just get your basic needs on a daily basis. I know that all of us here in this meeting wouldn't feel stable for a day, not knowing when your basic needs are coming. So to amplify that people are having mental health issues or suicidal or self-harming, and then that added anxiety is placed on them, there isn't anything stabilizing about that. There isn't anything normal about it. And so you're expecting so much from the broken, and you're putting them in the worst case scenario. And you add the basic conditions of segregation. One, it's cold. It's extremely cold in there. You're also, it's noisy, as I've mentioned. And the other fact, it's really dirty. It's really dirty because people go back there and they carve on the walls, or they chip the paint, or they throw stuff on the walls. And none of that is cleaned up because they're just rotating people in and out. And there isn't like a cleanup crew. There isn't a cart that comes by that you clean your cell with or anything like that. And, you have people who are in destructive mode being locked up in a cell with only themselves to deal with or to help them get out of something, and they're broken. And so they're destroying themselves back there. A friend of mine, she literally carved on her face, she carved on her thighs, she carved on her arms. And, there was another gal who they took her to the shower, and she was known to self-harm, and they gave her clippers. And they left her alone for 45 minutes. And she literally carved on herself. She cut half of her hair off and half of it was left. She had cut her ear. And, that's supposed to be the place where they are minding people and what they are doing with the utmost care, and they aren't.
I mean, it sounds horrific, the things that you're saying, but also in some ways, if you just think about it from a common sense perspective, it just feels like these are obvious things that would happen to people that are, not stable, that have, either suicidal ideations or in a mental health crisis, or, maybe dealing with things related to addiction, whatever it may be. You put them in an environment like that, it just does seem like it's just going to exacerbate all the worst qualities about your well-being. And but what do the cells look like? I mean, is there a window? Is there natural light? Is there fresh air? Is there anything? Mark gave us a little bit of a description of in the men's prison, and Julia, you visited recently isolation in Coffee Creek. So maybe Kyle, if you can just kind of give us a description of what the cells look like back there, and then Julia, what you experienced when you went to go visit it yourself.
You would think that they would be dark, but they're not. They're the exact opposite. There is a light that comes on at 5 a.m. and it doesn't go off until 10. And it isn't just a normal room light. It is a bright security light. And there isn't a window. There's a little slit that you can look out of to look onto the segregation unit. But there are a lot of the segregation doors that have an entryway to them, and then there is another door, and that's where they shower, in that kind of atrium right there before you go into the solitary confinement unit. And they're cold. They're really cold. It's cinder block. It's painted cinder block. The bed is metal, the toilet's metal, the sink is metal, and it's all one container. And when you talk about suicide attempts and about women going back on suicide watch, to think about somebody at their lowest point in life who wants to take their life, and then the stabilization, so to speak, is to put them in a cold cell, strip them, put them in a smock, and then leave them there and then watch them. And that's supposed to help someone get through that process. And so there isn't anything uplifting about being in that cell. And yeah.
Julia, do you want to share with us what you saw? You recently went on a tour, and part of that was able to include a visit back into the solitary units.
When we went on the tour, we saw only one side of the solitary units, and they had cleared it all out except for one individual in there. So I'm guessing everyone got put in the other unit, and it looked like it had just been cleaned, and it was definitely set up for a tour. It's chilling, or like it's a little stomach turning to think back on that, of walking into those cells there. There is no window there. It is a small room. There's a toilet and a bed that I think is on a cement block. And then, just to walk into that space and imagine even having to spend 30 minutes, an hour, and then to think about days, it's just really hard to stand in there. And I just remember thinking, I have to get out of this space. And I made myself go back in again, because I thought hopefully I'm never going to have this opportunity again to see what this is like. But it is, it's chilling to be in that space. And that it was confusing about that atrium that Kyle was talking about, because there's a shower there. And when it's an atrium, you're talking about like maybe a 2-foot wide space, and there's a shower, and the whole thing is just, it's just dark, and it is just not right to go in there. And before you even get to the unit with the cells, you get into this space, you walk into this space where they have a side room that I don't know if that's where they do strip searches. Then there's the classroom that Kyle was talking about with those chairs in it. And then there's a shower space there that is where you can basically look in, and they always have eyes on, they can have eyes on you during the shower. But before you get to that, there are these two cages that are look like phone booth sizes, and they are floor to, I think, ceiling cages that look like you couldn't move in there, and they clearly shouldn't be made for human beings. It's very dark and terrible looking. And then what we learned is that that is where they put people in to, again, stabilize them before I think they put them into the units. And what I've heard is that people can be in those cages and they don't know how long they're going to be in there. They're just put into those cages. And some people have like crouched down and sit on the floor in there. And there's like a slot, I guess. I don't know what they pass through there, but there's nothing, it is not right. Well, that just the whole experience was just really horrifying to be in there. And to even think about spending a day in there, and then this is a cleaned up version of what's actually going on.
Yeah, Kyle, did you want to mention?
Yeah, I'd like to say something about the cages and the GIPA and being on the advisory panel. And that was one of the recommendations that we put out there very early in the beginning. And just having them take those cages down would be a show of good faith that we really are trying to bring the standards of how we're caring for women up and how we're treating those who are incarcerated better. And to my knowledge, those cages are still there. They were there when we toured. And so, just such a simple act of taking those down could present a way different atmosphere in segregation in and of itself.
Mm.
And you didn't hear the screaming that both Kyle and Mark have talked about by being in there. It's like a very sanitized version of very like nightmarish place. And I remember I've had calls with people on SEG before, and you just hear it's so loud in the background, and people are just screaming. And I remember being on this call once with someone who we couldn't even do the call because she had been promised that she was going to be the first person to shower, and she ended up being the 10th person to shower. And she was just livid. I mean, talk about the deprivation. I mean, we couldn't even do the phone call because she was so upset about this, and she was just screaming, and people are screaming behind her. And so when we went on that tour, I mean, it's a nightmarish place in the cleanest version of it. And then it's just hard to imagine doing that to human beings in the day-to-day that they do it.
And, just as a reminder, this is not required by law. Like, there's nothing in Oregon statute that actually requires this, that actually creates any type of vision or guidelines for this. This is all solely based on the imaginations and creation of the Department of Corrections and Prisons. I mean, in the sense that they've created Solitary, they build these are designed by corrections engineers or architects or whatever, and then implemented by prison officials and things like that. But all this is to say that there's nothing that requires a prison to have these types of facilities for it to be built this way or to treat people this way. Like nothing is being required of them to do this except for culture and practice and a value system that sort of reinforces the idea that somehow this is needed. One of the things that you mentioned, Kyle and Mark, is the people with suicidal ideations that are put back there on what we call, or what you have mentioned as suicide watch. And to me, this feels like the worst thing you could do to someone is to put them in a unit like this if they're having these suicidal ideations. But I wonder, Mark and Kyle, if you could, I mean, you've mentioned this already, but maybe Mark, we'll start with you and come back to Kyle, but to talk about your experiences of what you saw with people who were dealing with suicidal ideations and how they were treated, and how perhaps the response of the prisons of putting them in these isolation units, like what was that like, watching people go through that? And, what did you see with that type of response?
Yeah, I'll start with kind of follow up to what you just said about how these are creations that they just decided they needed to come up with. But all of the research is suggesting at this point that that they don't deter misconduct in the prison system, and so that they aren't serving a benefit to the prison officials. But then the research also says that they are severely harmful to anyone that is subjected to this. I mean, the U.S. Supreme Court has said that in the 1800s, that it was causing people to break down mentally to be in these kind of settings. And in Oregon and nationally, your highest rates of self-harm and suicidal behavior occur in your segregation units. And yes, their response to someone who reveals or is identified as being at risk of self-harm or suicide is for them to put them in segregation, to the point that prisoners, myself included, while incarcerated, all prisoners would rather not reveal that they are struggling emotionally with issues, because they know the prison's response is to strip search them, take all their property, put them in a suicide smock with nothing else, and put them in solitary confinement until they are, quote unquote, stabilized and ready to come back to the general population. It is absolutely detrimental. And yes, through the years, I have witnessed and heard of numerous prisoners committing self-harm acts on themselves, cutting on themselves, and attempting or actually committing suicide within our segregation units. I mean, this is a well-documented problem in the Oregon prison system and nationally.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it just sounds horrific. If you're struggling with those types of issues, that the place that they put you in is the worst possible place that you can think of.
Well, and what you need in those moments is connection and people that care about you, and it removes you from any of that you were able to create in the prison system. It takes you away from that, and it also takes away your ability to access the things that are available for you to connect with people who love you in the community outside of prison. You're not able to make phone calls to people. You're not able to have the visits until you're in segregation for a set period of time. And then when you do, it's through glass and with handcuffs and shackles. And so everything they're doing to help somebody, quote unquote, help somebody, is causing them harm.
Kyle, is there anything you want to add?
There is, and Mark alluded to it in regards to not being able to use the phones, but historically in the women's institution, one of the things, the reason that you're taken to seg and the reason that it is a disciplinary act to try to commit suicide or harm yourself is because you are considered state property. And so to know that the state is penalizing you because when you do try to commit suicide or do self-harm, you are given a disciplinary report, which will cause you to have a loss of privileges, which even amplifies that you can't use the phone for that much longer and that you can't connect with your family for that much longer. And, you know, when you get sanctioned like that, you lose money. It costs you money to get in trouble. You could lose your job. And so the way that everything, they amplify the amount of heartache that you're already undergoing. If you're feeling suicidal, now you're losing your job. Now you're paying the state money. Now you have loss of privileges and you can't make phone calls. Plus there's the humiliation of being escorted down the corridor by 2 officers and taken to segregation. Prior to releasing, there was a woman, a staff member, and she had decided to talked to a woman who was waiting to go back to segregation. She was handcuffed, and there was an officer standing right there, and she was administrative staff member, and she started to talk to the girl to kind of, ask her what was going on, what did she need, and things like that. And she was reprimanded for doing that, and she very soon quit the Department of Corrections because she just couldn't handle the fact of the way that we were treating people, or the way that they were treating people who were suicidal, which was their solution was segregation. And so it's just, when Mark is saying no, nobody wants to tell if they're feeling suicidal or doing self-harm, because the repercussions are just, they don't stop.
Well, and to piggyback off that just briefly, I remember one prisoner that was severely mentally ill that was in the segregation units, and he attempted to commit suicide on numerous occasions. He would do things like break the plexiglass window in the cell and then use that as a knife to cut himself. And oftentimes, many times, I can't remember exactly how many at this point, but the prison officials would charge him with inmate in possession of a weapon, and he would end up with an additional 5 years added on to his sentence because the local prosecutor prosecuted this mentally ill person for harming himself with some quote unquote weapon that he had been able to fashion in a seg unit. And he ended up with years and years and years tacked onto his sentence because of his self-harm behavior in segregation.
Yeah, it is. There was something else that I wanted to talk about, and it is the retaliation and the bullying and the things that officers find funny while people are in segregation, and they find it funny to deprive someone of their basic needs, and they're bullied if they're, the gal who was on death row really suffered quite a bit of harm from segregation, and officers would tell her that if she told, they wouldn't give her anything. They would take her things away, and she lived in such fear that she was a ball of anxiety at most points in time, because she was so afraid of what they would do to her if she spoke about the things that she saw or the things that they said to her. And when nobody sees how you act, and when no one has recourse to tell anybody, that's a horrible, horrible designed system. And, like you said, Bobbin, that there isn't a legal precedent set that we need to have a segregation, and that we've created it within our own institutions. It's more devious than those that are coming into prison. And it's sad.
Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit about the oversight of solitary and legal mechanisms to challenge it, because what we've discovered is there's virtually none, and that'll be in a follow-up episode. But going back to this this sense or this idea that you talked about, Kyle, when there isn't that oversight and there are these power dynamics, the type of abuse that occurs, and we talked about some of the sexual abuse that occurred at Coffee Creek, and in particular, there's some instances or an instance in which this happened back in the segregation unit. I think, Mark, you had some additional information that you wanted to share.
And it fits exactly with what Kyle was just talking about. While we've been talking today, I mentioned the newspaper article about this gal that was sexually abused in the seg unit. I went to the federal court's website and pulled up the complaint on it. And the amended complaint filed February 21st of this year in the case. It's an active case right now. Has a really stark introductory statement I'd really like to read just briefly here. It'll give you a kind of sense of this. They're identifying.
We'll put there would have been a content warning at the outset of this podcast episode, but I just want to flag additional content warning before we read this.
So this is a lawsuit that was filed by a Portland attorney, Lynn Walsh, and attorneys from Disability Rights Oregon, and they're identifying this gal by initials JB, and it says, JB is a young woman who was incarcerated at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility, the only women's prison in the Oregon Department of Corrections system. She suffers from psychiatric disabilities and has a horrid history of physical and sexual abuse as a child, including being a victim of sex trafficking while in the custody of the Oregon Department of Human Services. While at Coffee Creek, JB was sexually abused by Correctional Officer Levi Gray for almost 2 months in the segregation unit. Sergeant Levi Gray had a long history of Prisoner Rape Elimination Act complaints from women corrections officers regarding intimidation, and a history of not following policies and procedures, yet he has never been reprimanded or fired. Other officers, particularly Captain David Gonzalez, knew at a minimum that Sergeant Gray was violating prison policies regarding boundaries with women in custody and was accused of sexually abusing women prisoners, yet Captain Gonzalez took no action to stop Sergeant Gray. The segregation correction officers charged with protecting JB knew or should have known that Gray was sexually abusing JB, but they failed to stop the abuse. Since the abuse, JB was subjected to severe retaliation, including harmful, discriminatory, and harassing behavior, such as being hauled through the prison in a body bag, being forced to sleep on the floor without a mattress or proper clothing to keep warm, and numerous uses of force. JB's treatment demonstrates ODOC's management's complete inability to operate a women's prison without violating minimal constitutional protections and the Federal Prison Rape Elimination Act regulations that prohibit retaliation for reporting sexual abuse. And this just echoes everything the GIPA report said about segregation and sexual abuse of women at Coffee Creek. That was 2 years ago, and our elected officials have done nothing in response to this. Nothing.
Yeah. I mean, I think, like I said, we'll have a follow-up conversation on the GIPA report and the GIPA response specifically. But, this idea of what Kyle had mentioned, out of sight, out of mind, this is what prisons are. And you create like these asymmetric power dynamic, it's going to be set up ripe for abuse. I mean, that in itself, you exacerbate those power dynamics and the out of sight sort of aspects of this by putting people in isolation. I mean, you're basically putting gasoline on a fire on all the types of like dynamics that help create the conditions for abuse and misconduct and harm, not only between the staff and the individual, but then it's also just, again, pouring gasoline on a fire on all the stuff like the mental health, physical health, trauma histories. You put someone in an environment like that, all it's going to do is it's going to be, to use the GIPA report word, it's going to be, rather than stabilizing, profoundly destabilizing for any individual. I think any individual that goes into that environment without any of those conditions, it'll be profoundly destabilizing. So to have any type of thought or expectation that any individual that has any type of background or history with, these life experiences or conditions, it seems kind of foolish to think that somehow it's going to be made better. But, we're just over an hour, and, Kyle, thank you for sharing your insights and knowledge about Coffee Creek and isolation. But I don't know, Julia, Kyle, any last thoughts or comments you'd like to share about solitary at Coffee Creek, and Mark, generally solitary?
Well, I'd just like to add on the GIPA report, while you pulled out that language about stabilization, what it says is that it's virtually impossible. Mm-hmm. I mean, and that's coming from, a report that's not meant to be hard hitting, and really meant to sort of lay things out. And they're talking just about the design and the current condition. It's not even including the dynamics of the officers and the that part of it that people have to endure. And for it to be virtually impossible for you to get to a place of stabilization, which to me reads as like, it's completely the case that you're going to be unstable, and you're going to have distress and have mental health issues. And to know that this is completely unnecessary and it's not serving any purpose. I don't know how the department continues on with this, and how legislators and state leaders are not calling for this to all come to an end.
I don't either.
I wonder if it's intentional to destabilize people like this.
I mean, there is some intention because it's all founded on a value system that believes that these prisons are necessary and these isolation units are necessary. But I think,
and these people deserve this.
Yeah, and to your point, Julia, I mean, I think to me, it is very confusing and very disturbing that the governor doesn't seem to care about this, that legislators don't seem to care about this. In fact, a lot are very deferential to DOC and sort of the things that they're saying, and just push past these inhumane treatments, and that the DOC is okay with this as well. I mean, it is a vile, inhumane way to treat people. I'm sorry, I'm soapboxing now, but Kyle, any last thoughts?
I do. I have lots. I do. I have lots of thoughts, and two of them are, we listen to conditions in other countries of the way that people are treated, and we're appalled, and we fight it, and we stand up for how wrong it is and demand that people be treated better. And then we do it here in America, and we justify it because it is connected to a crime. And like Mark just said, that we think that people deserve it, or that they got themselves in that position, and nobody puts themselves in a position to be treated poorly and to have added stressors and anxiety when you don't get to prison because you got everything going great in your life. You get to prison because you're not maneuvering through life in some sort of dysfunctional way. And so for the Department of Corrections to continue to add to that dysfunction is just wrong on so many levels. And in ending this podcast today, I feel the very same way that I used to feel after I would go spend a couple hours visiting somebody in segregation. And it is sad and moved because you leave people there and you know that they're stuck there 24/7, 365, 1,440 minutes of a day. They are experiencing that and trying to figure out how not to kill themselves, how not to cut on themselves, how not to use, how not to be dysfunctional. And the Department of Corrections hails themselves at doing such a great job. And that's the sickest part of it. And that's all I have to say.
I don't know that there's anything more to say. Thank you for those comments, Kyle. I mean, it's, I think one of the things that, our hope is to help bring people into these issues and help them understand what's happening here in Oregon in their name, and how we're treating our neighbors and community members inside these walls. And so I appreciate you, both Mark and, you, Kyle, sharing your experiences and what it's like inside the prisons here in Oregon. And hopefully, we can, this is a priority issue for this organization to try to abolish solitary here in Oregon. And so I think it's going to take more people be willing to understand what these experiences are like, and acknowledging and accepting that this is inhumane, and that, again, that it's happening in all of our names to people in our community. So thank you. We'll be back next week with another episode of Trailblazing Justice. We'll follow up on this conversation with Solitary Part 3, where we'll talk about the administrative and legal oversights or challenges to solitary. This is a bit of a trick question, Mark. Is there any administrative or legal oversight of solitary?
Stay tuned.
Short answer is no. The short answer is no.
That is the short answer, yes.
And, there are people who have raised solutions to the Department of Corrections administrative administration in regards to ways that they could help people who are a detriment to their community while not harming them at the same time. And they just flat out say no. And that is sad as well, is that they're not even open for options that could work better for people.
I think that's the hardest part, is coming up against that wall, is that, because I think, like, even from our perspective, it's we don't know the answers, but the only thing that we're asking for is to have a more serious conversation about seeking out better options and solutions and answers. But people aren't even willing to have those conversations. They're so dug into sort of the current practices and policies and trajectory that we're on, that they're unwilling to deviate from that. But yeah, that is, I think, one of the most difficult or challenging aspects of our work.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting this.
Yeah. As I mentioned, we'll be back with another episode on solitary. We'll talk about the legal and administrative challenges. As we very shortly described, there aren't any. And then we'll move on to a follow-up conversation on solitary, talking about the social science and, what it's revealing to us and the legal challenges that we have going on at OJRC. So we hope to bring this full, robust arc on solitary to you so that people can understand it. And we'll be back soon. Thanks.